Duluth must be a place of untold delights, Mr. Speaker. If I could be actuated by any conceivable inducement to betray the sacred trust reposed in me by those whose generous confidence I am indebted for the honor of a seat on this floor, if I could be influenced by any possible consideration to become instrumental in giving away, in violation of their known wishes, any portion of their interest in the public domain for the mere promotion of any railroad enterprise whatever, I should certainly feel a strong inclination to give this measure my most earnest and hearty support, for I am assured that its success would materially enhance the pecuniary prosperity of some of the most valued friends I have on earth, friends for whose accommodation I would be willing to make almost any sacrifice, not involving my personal honor or my fidelity as the trustee of an express trust. And that fact of itself would be sufficient to countervail almost any objection I might entertain to the passage of this bill, not inspired by an imperative and an inexorable sense of public duty. This is Proctor Knott of Kentucky, captivates the U.S. House of Representatives, January 27th, 1871. But independent of the seductive influence of private friendship, to which I admit I am perhaps as susceptible as any of the gentlemen I see around me, the intrinsic merits of the measure itself are of such an extraordinary character as to commend it most strongly to the favorable consideration of every member of this House, myself not excepted, notwithstanding my constituents in whose behalf alone I am acting here, would not be befitted by its passage one particle more than they would be by a project to cultivate an orange grove on the bleakest summit of Greenland's icy mountains. Now, sir, as to those great trunk lines of railway spanning the continent from ocean to ocean, I confess my mind has never been fully made up. It is true they may afford some trifling advantages to local traffic, and they may even in time become the channels of a more extended commerce. Yet I've never been thoroughly satisfied either of the necessity or expediency of projects promising such meager results to the great body of our people. But with regard to the transcendent merits of the gigantic enterprise contemplated in this bill, I never entertained the shadow of a doubt. Years ago, when I first heard that there was somewhere in the vast terra incognita, somewhere in the bleak regions of the great Northwest, a stream of water known to the nomadic inhabitants of the neighborhood as the River St. Croix, I became satisfied that the construction of a railroad from that raging torrent to some point in the civilized world was essential to the happiness and prosperity of the American people, if not absolutely indispensable to the perpetuity of Republican institutions on this continent. I felt instinctively that the boundless resources of that prolific region of sand and pine shrubbery would never be fully developed without a railroad constructed and equipped at the expense of the government, and perhaps not even then. I had an abiding presentiment that some day or other the people of this whole country, irrespective of party affiliation, regardless of sectional prejudices, and without distinction of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, would rise in their majesty and demand an outlet for their enormous agricultural productions of those vast and fertile pine barrens, drained by the rainy season by the surging waters of the turbid St. Croix. These impressions, derived simply and solely from the eternal fitness of things, were not only strengthened by the interesting and eloquent debate on this bill to which I listened with so much pleasure the other day, but intensified, if possible, as I read over this morning the lively colloquy which took place on that occasion, as I find it reported in last Friday's Globe. I will ask the indulgence of the House while I read a few short passages which are sufficient in my judgment to place the merits of the great enterprise contemplated in the measure now under discussion beyond all possible controversy. The honorable gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Wilson, who I believe is managing this bill, in speaking of the character of the country through which this railroad is to pass, says this: "We want to have the timber brought to us as cheaply as possible. Now, if you tie up the lands in this way so that no title can be obtained to them for no settler will go on these lands, for he cannot make a living. You would deprive us of the benefit of that timber. Now, sir, I would not have it by any means inferred from this that the gentleman from Minnesota would insinuate that the people out of his section desire this timber merely for the purpose of fencing up their farms so that their stock may not wander off and die of starvation among the bleak hills of the St. Croix. I read it for no such purpose, sir, and make no such comment on it myself. In corroboration of this statement of the gentleman from Minnesota, I find this testimony given by the honorable gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Washburn. Speaking of these same lands, he says, under the bill as amended by my friend from Minnesota, 9/10 of the land is open to actual settlers at $2.50 per acre. The remaining 1/10 is pine timbered land that is not fit for settlement and never will be settled upon, but the timber will be cut off. I admit that it is the most valuable portion of the grant, for most of the grant is not valuable. It is quite valueless. And if you put in this amendment of the gentleman from Indiana, you may as well just kill the bill, for no man and no company will take the grant and build the road. I simply pause here to ask some gentleman better versed in the science of mathematics than I am to tell me if the timbered lands are in fact the most valuable portion of that section of the country, and they would be entirely valueless without the timber that is on them, what the remainder of the land is worth, which has no timber on it at all. But further on, I find a most entertaining and instructive interchange of views between the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Rogers, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Washburn, and the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Peters, upon the subject of pine lands generally, which I will tax the patience of the House to read. Mr. Rogers, will the gentleman allow me to ask a question, Mr. Washburn of Wisconsin? Certainly. Mr. Rogers, are these pine lands entirely worthless except for timber? Mr. Washburn of Wisconsin, they are generally worthless for any other purpose. I am perfectly familiar with that subject. These lands are not valuable for purposes of settlement. Mr. Farnsworth, they will be after the timber is taken off. Mr. Washburn of Wisconsin, no, sir. Mr. Rogers, I want to know the character of these pine lands. Mr. Washburn of Wisconsin, they are generally sandy. That was Mr. Rogers from before. They are generally sandy, barren lands. My friend from the Green Bay district, Mr. Sawyer, it's like the SLV, is himself perfectly familiar with this question, and he will bear me out in what I say, that these pine timbered lands are not adapted to settlement. Mr. Rogers, the pine lands to which I am accustomed are generally very good. What I want to know is, what is the difference between our pine lands and your pine lands? Mr. Washburn of Wisconsin, the pine timber of Wisconsin generally grows upon barren, sandy land. The gentleman from Maine, Mr. Peters, who's familiar with pine lands, will, I have no doubt, say that pine timber grows generally upon the most barren lands. Mr. Peters, as a general things, pine lands are not worth much for cultivation. And further on, I find this pregnant question, the joint production of the two gentlemen from Wisconsin. Mr. Payne, does my friend from Indiana suppose that in any event settlers will occupy and cultivate these pine lands? Mr. Washburn of Wisconsin, particularly without a railroad? Yes, sir, particularly without a railroad. It would be asked after a while, I'm afraid, if settlers will go anywhere unless the government builds a railroad for them to go on. I desire to call attention to only one more statement, which I think sufficient to settle the question. It is one made by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Payne, who says these lands will be abandoned for the present. It may be that at some remote period there will spring up in that region a new kind of agriculture which will cause a demand for these particular lands, and they may then come into use and be valuable for agricultural purposes. But I know, and I cannot help thinking that my friend from Indiana understands that for the present and for many years to come, these pine lands can have no possible value other than arising from the pine timber which now stands upon them. Now, sir, who, after listening to this emphatic and unequivocal testimony of these intelligent, competent, and able-bodied witnesses, who that is not as incredulous as St. Thomas himself, will doubt for a moment that the Goshen, Goshen of America, is to be found in the sandy valleys and upon the pine-clad hills of the St. Croix, who will have the hardihood to rise in his seat on this floor and assert that, excepting the pine bushes, the entire region would not produce vegetation enough in 10 years to fatten a grasshopper, Where is the patriot who is willing that his country shall incur the peril of remaining another day without the amplest railroad connection with such an inexhaustible mine of agricultural wealth? Who will answer for the consequences of abandoning a great and warlike people in possession of a country like that to brood over the indifference and neglect of their government? How long would it be before they would take to studying the Declaration of Independence and hatching out the damnable heresy of secession? How long before the grim demon of civil discord would rear again his horrid head in our midst, gnash loud with his iron fangs, and shake his crest of bristling bayonets? Then, sir, think of the long and painful process of reconstruction that must follow with its concomitant amendments to the Constitution, the 17th, 18th, and 19th Articles. The 16th, it is, of course, understood, it is to be appropriated to those blushing damsels who are day after day beseeching us to let them vote, hold office, drink cocktails, ride a straddle, and do everything else the men do. But above all, sir, let me implore you to reflect for a single moment on the deplorable condition of our country in case of a foreign war, with all our ports blockaded, all our cities in a state of siege, the gaunt specter of famine brooding like a hungry vulture over our starving land, our commissary stores all exhausted, and our famishing armies withering away in the field, a helpless prey to the insatiate demon of hunger, our navy rotting in the docks for want of provisions for our gallant seamen, and we without any railroad communication whatever with the prolific pine thickets of the St. Croix. Ah, sir, I can very well understand why my amiable friends from Pennsylvania, Mr. Myers, Mr. Kelly, and Mr. O'Neill, should have been so earnest in their support of this bill the other day, and if their honorable colleague, my friend Mr. Randall, will pardon the remark, I will say I considered his criticism of their action on that occasion as not only unjust but ungenerous. I knew they were looking forward with the far-reaching kin of enlightened statesmanship to the pitiable condition in which Philadelphia would be left unless speedily supplied with railroad connection in some way or other with this garden spot of the universe. And besides, sir, this discussion has relieved my mind of a mystery that has weighed upon it like an incubus for years. I could never understand before why there was so much excitement during the last Congress over the acquisition of Alta Villa. I can never understand why it was that some of our ablest statesmen and our most disinterested patriots should entertain such dark forebodings of the untold calamities that were to befall our beloved country unless we should take immediate possession of that desirable island. But I see now that they are laboring under the mistaken impression that the government would need the guano to manure the public lands on the St. Croix. Now, sir, I repeat, I've been satisfied for years that if there were any portion of the inhabited globe absolutely in a suffering condition for want of a railroad, it was these teeming pine barrens of the St. Croix. At what particular point on that noble stream such a road should be commenced, I knew was immaterial. And so it seems to have been considered by the draftsmen of this bill. It might be up at the spring or down at the footlog or the water gate or the fish dam or anywhere along the bank, no matter where, but in what direction it should run or where it should terminate were always to my mind questions of the most painful perplexity. I could conceive of no place on God's green earth in such straitened circumstances for railroad facilities as to be likely to desire or willing to accept such a connection. I knew that neither Bayfield nor Superior City would have it, for they both indignantly spurned the munificence of the government when coupled with such ignominious conditions, and let this very same land grant die on their hands years and years later, years and years ago, rather than submit to the degradation of a direct communication by railroad with the piney woods of the St. Croix. And I knew that what the enterprising inhabitants of those giant young cities would refuse to take would have few charms for others, whatever their necessities or cupidity might be. Hence, as I have said, sir, I was utterly at a loss to determine where the terminus of this great and indispensable road should be until I accidentally overheard some gentleman the other day mention the name of Duluth. Duluth! 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 The word fell upon my ear with a peculiar and indescribable charm, like the gentle murmur of a low fountain stealing forth in the mist of roses, or the soft, sweet accents of an angels whisper in the bright, joyous dream of sleeping innocence. Duluth, 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 'twas the name for which my soul had panted for years, as the hart panteth for the water brooks. But where was Duluth? Never in all my limited reading had my vision been gladdened by seeing that celestial word in print, and I felt a profounder humiliation in my ignorance that its dull set syllables had never before ravished my delighted ear. I was certain the draftsman of this bill had never heard of it, or it would have been designated as one of the termini of this road. I asked my friends about it, but they knew nothing of it. I rushed to the library, examined all the maps I could find. I discovered in one of them a delicate, hair-like line diverging from the Mississippi near a place marked Prescott, which I suppose was intended to represent the river St. Croix, but I could nowhere find Duluth. Nevertheless, I was confident that Duluth existed somewhere and that its discovery would constitute the crowning glory of the present century, if not of all modern times. I knew it was bound to exist in the very nature of things, that the symmetry and perfection of our planetary system would be incomplete without it, that the elements of material nature would long since have resolved themselves back into original chaos if there had been such a hiatus in creation as would have resulted from leaving out Duluth. In fact, sir, I was overwhelmed with the conviction that Duluth not only existed somewhere, but that wherever it was a great and glorious place. I was convinced that the greatest calamity that ever befell the benighted nations of the ancient world was in their having passed away without a knowledge of the actual existence of Duluth, that their fabled Atlantis never been saved by the hallowed vision of inspired poesy was, in fact, but another name for Duluth, that the golden orchard of the Hesperides was but a poetical synonym for the beer gardens in the vicinity of Duluth. I was certain that Herodotus had died a miserable death because in all his travels, with all his geographical research, he had never heard of Duluth. I knew that if the immortal spirit of Homer could look down from another heaven than that created by his own celestial genius upon the long lines of pilgrims from every nation of the earth, to the gushing fountain of poesy opened by the touch of his magic wand, Poesy, if he could be permitted to behold the vast assemblage of grand and glorious productions of the lyric art called into being by his own inspired strains, he would weep tears of bitter anguish that instead of lavishing all the stores of his mighty genius upon the fall of Ilion, it had not been his more blessed lot to crystallize in deathless song the rising glories of Duluth. Yet, sir, had it not been for this map kindly furnished me by the legislature of Minnesota, I might have gone down to my obscure and humble grave in my agony of despair because I could nowhere find Duluth. Had such been my melancholy fate, I have no doubt that with the last feeble pulsation of my breaking heart, that with the last faint exhalation of my fleeting breath, I should have whispered, "But where is Duluth?" But thanks to the beneficence of that band of ministering angels who have their bright abodes in the far-off capital of Minnesota, just as the agony of my anxiety was about to culminate in a frenzy of despair, this blessed map was placed in my hands. I unfolded it as a resplendent scene of ineffable glory opened before me, such as I imagine burst upon the enraptured vision of the wandering Peri through the opening of paradise. There, for the first time, my enchanted eye rested upon the ravishing word, Duluth. This map, sir, is intended, as it appears from its title, to illustrate the position of Duluth in the United States. But if gentlemen will examine it, I think they will concur with me in the opinion that it is far too modest in its pretensions. It not only illustrates the position of Duluth in the United States, but exhibits its relations with all created things. It even goes further than this. It lifts the shadowy veil of futurity and affords us a view of the golden prospects of Duluth far along the dim vista of ages yet to come. If gentlemen will examine it, they will find Duluth not only in the center of the map, but represented in the center of a series of concentric circles 100 miles apart. some of them as much as 4,000 miles in diameter, embracing alike in their tremendous sweep the fragrant savannas of the sunlit south and the eternal solitudes of snow that mantle the ice-bound north. How these circles were produced is perhaps one of the most primordial mysteries that the most skillful paleologist will never be able to explain. But the fact is, sir, Duluth is preeminently a central place. For I'm told so by gentlemen who have been so reckless of their own personal safety as to venture away into those awful regions where Duluth is supposed to be, that is so exactly in the center of the visible universe that the sky comes down at precisely the same distance all around it. I find by reference to this map that Duluth is situated somewhere near the western end of Lake Superior, but as there is no dot or other mark indicating its exact location, I'm unable to say whether it is actually confined to any particular spot or whether Duluth is just lying around there loose somewhere. I cannot really tell whether it is one of those ethereal creations of intellectual frostwork, more intangible than the rose-tinted clouds of a summer sunset, one of those airy exhalations of the speculator's brain, which I am told are ever flitting in the form of towns and cities along those lines of railroad built with government subsidies. Learn the unwary settler as the mirage of the desert lures the famishing traveler on and ever on until it fades away in the darkening horizon, or whether it is a real bona fide substantial city all staked off with the lots marked with their owners' names, like that proud commercial metropolis recently discovered on the desirable shores of San Domingo. But however that may be, I'm satisfied Duluth is there or thereabout, for I see it stated here on this map that it is exactly 3,990 miles from Liverpool. Though I have no doubt for the sake of convenience it'll be moved back 10 miles so as to make the distance an even 4,000 miles. Duluth and Liverpool is 4,000 miles apart. Then, sir, there's the climate of Duluth, unquestionably the most salubrious and delightful to be found anywhere on the Lord's earth. Now, I've always been under the impression, salubrious, I've always been under the impression that I presume other gentlemen have, that in the region around Lake Superior it was cold enough for at least 9 months in the year to freeze the smoke stack off a locomotive. But I see it represented on this map that Duluth is situated exactly halfway between the latitudes of Paris and Venice, so that gentlemen who have inhaled the exhilarating airs of the one or bask in the golden sunlight of the other may see at a glance that Duluth must be a place of untold delights, a terrestrial paradise fanned by the balmy zephyrs of an eternal spring. Zephyrs, cloth in the gorgeous sheen of ever-blooming flowers, and vocal with the silvery melody of nature's choicest songsters. In fact, sir, since I have seen this map, I have no doubt that Byron was vainly endeavoring to convey some faint conception of the delicious charms of Duluth, when his poetic soul gushed forth in the rippling strains of that beautiful rhapsody. Know ye the land of the cedar and vine, where the flowers ever blossom, the beams ever shine, where the light wings of zephyr, oppressed with perfume, wax faint over the gardens of gall in their bloom, where the citron and olive are fairest of fruit, and the voice of the nightingale never is mute, where the tints of the earth and the lines of the sky, in color though varied, in beauty may vie. As to the commercial resources of Duluth, sir, they are simply illimitable and inexhaustible, as is shown by this map. I see it stated here that there's a vast scope of territory embracing an area of over 2 million square miles, rich in every element of material wealth and commercial prosperity, all tributary to Duluth. Look at it, sir. Pointed to the map. Here are inexhaustible mines of gold, immeasurable veins of silver, impenetrable depths of boundless forest, vast coal measures, wide extended plains of richest pasturage, all embraced in this vast territory, which must, in the very nature of things, empty the untold treasures of its commerce into the lap of Duluth. Look at it, sir. Do not you see from these broad brown lines drawn around this immense territory that the enterprising inhabitants of Duluth intend someday to enclose it all in one vast corral, so that its commerce will be bound to go there whether it would or not? And here, sir, still pointing to the map, I find within a convenient distance the Piegan Indians, Piegan
which of all the many accessories to the glory of Duluth, I consider by far the most inestimable. For, sir, I've been told that when the smallpox breaks out amongst the women and children of that famous tribe, as it sometimes does, they afford the finest subjects in the world for the strategic experiments of any enterprising military hero who desires to improve himself in the noble art of war, especially for any valiant lieutenant general whose